Thank you so much, Barbara. It's lovely to be here among friends because I was here last year. It's great to be to know people, to see Massimo again. So lovely. I'm on this rather crazy 3-week, 15-city, I think it is, whirlwind tour, which I put together, by the way. People look at my timetable and they say, your publishers must be really working you hard. But I actually organised it. But it just happened that I put all these invitations together. So anyway, lots of institutions that I haven't known. So lovely to be at one that I do. So the book, as Barbara was saying, is called Wounded Shepherd, Pope Francis and his struggle to convert the Catholic Church. It's a very provocative title. We like provocative titles, we writers. But it does capture something that I think I've learnt in following Francis over the last 3 years, which is that what he's really intent upon is something much deeper than a structural conversion, a structural reform. It's much more than changes in governance and structure. It's something much deeper. And this came to me in various different ways, but not least that a famous commentator on the papacy, who many of you will have heard of, Father Antonio Spadaro, the Jesuit director of Civiltà Cattolica, once asked Francis directly, using the title of my biography, which is The Great Reformer, do you consider yourself a reformer? And he said, no, what I think I'm doing is I'm putting Christ at the centre of the church and the reforms flow from there. Now that's, sort of thing you might expect a pope to say, I'm putting Christ at the centre. It can almost sound like a cliche. But I've come to realise in following him and in trying to capture what it is that he's trying to do, I've realised that that really is a key. And so rather than the Great Reformer, I say at the beginning of the book, I've rather repented, if you like, of that title, that I now see him in a slightly different way. And the image that I've used in the book is one of a director of a retreat, a spiritual director of an Ignatian retreat, who is accompanying the church on a kind of journey of conversion. That partly also particularly hit me when I had a meeting with him last year. I've met him various times briefly, but this was the first time I had a sit down with him for about 45 minutes. And the first thing he said to me floored me, which was, thank you so much for taking the time to come and see me, which completely floored me. The second thing he said to me was, I've read various things that you've written and I just have one criticism. So I kind of braced myself thinking of all the mistakes that I'd made. And he smiled and said, I think you're too kind to me, or too indulgent. So I said I promised to be tougher on him in future, which he liked. But then he went on to say something which really stayed with me afterwards, which is that when I was elected in March 2013, I didn't have a plan. I didn't come with some great plan that I wanted to impose. And of course that's true. He came with a suitcase and he was expecting to go back to Buenos Aires. On the other hand, he did come with a discernment. And that's really what I've been trying to communicate so much in this book, that he comes from a Latin American church which had conducted in 2007 what I still maintain is the profoundest signs of the times discernment that the church had done anywhere in the world. That's to say, they looked at the contemporary modernity and they said, why is it that the church has such difficulty in evangelizing, in offering the gospel to this changing modernity, this secularized, globalized, technocratic modernity? But rather than, as so often in the United States and in Europe, lament and condemn secularization and change, they actually said, how do we, the church, need to change in order to evangelize this contemporary modernity? So the heart of the book, and when I set out to write it in 2016, and I wrote it because the publisher said, so what happened with the Great Reform? He's the Great Reformer, what happened? I wanted to tell that story, to tell the story of a church which now has a new ecclesial centre. There's always one area of the church throughout history which has always been the source for the rest of the church. The idea of the source, the rest of the church reflects that source. So early church, Middle East, in the 16th century, 17th century, it would have been the time of the Counter-Reformation. Spain and Italy would be the source church. Second Vatican Council, Germany, France, Belgium, and so on. So what we're dealing with now is that Latin America has become the source of that of the universal church. And that shift is what I wanted to try and account for in the book. But I had to deal with also the question, particularly in 2016 when Amoris Laetitia came out, I found that I had to also account for something I wasn't expecting to account for, which was a deeply hostile resistance to the pontificate. Now, every pope has their critics, but it's really quite striking, isn't it, how much Francis has encountered resistance. And indeed, the heart of that resistance is this country, is the United States, the church in this country particularly. And I get asked about this all the time. I have always been asked about it. And I suppose explaining it and accounting for that resistance has been a major challenge. And I'm just going to offer a couple of distinctions that I think is important to make, and then go on to go into where I think Francis himself, his own writings, shed some light on this. The first distinction to make, the first level of analysis, if you like, is, and it's an obvious thing to say, but important to say, is that resistance is not the same as criticism. Every pope is always criticized. Criticism is normal, and in fact part of the freedom of speech that we enjoy in the church. And wherever I go giving these talks, there's always plenty of people saying, why aren't more women in positions of seniority? What happened to the female diaconate? Why was he slow on sex abuse? All this is totally fine and inevitable and normal, and again, part of a healthy church. Popes it's a personal kind of authority that popes exercise, and therefore it's understandable that people prefer one kind of pope to another. Well, one of the coldest receptions I've ever had in talking about Francis was in Poland, where clearly their idea of a pope is John Paul II and there is no other. So these critiques are inevitable. Resistance, however, is different. It's more like a kind of withdrawal of goodwill, a distrustful self-withholding. Or it can be an active hostility, a resentment, which is sometimes passive-aggressive, but sometimes contemptuous, furious, accusing. And I think the line is crossed. I mean, theologically, I'm not sure where the line is crossed. One can discuss it. But it seems to me obvious, looking at the church, that there is a line that is crossed when people seek to deny the Pope legitimacy, to say in some way, we reject his teaching. We think the Holy Spirit is not there. Yeah, that seems to me the line that is crossed. Now, the Pope himself makes an important distinction. He says he welcomes criticism, in fact, asks for criticism, but he distinguishes between goodwill criticism, which has the good of the church in mind, and then he talks about a kind of bad spirit resistance, using Ignatian language. And he talks about two kinds of resistance. One is those who appear to be loyal and supportive, but secretly are undermining you. And the other kind are the ones who accuse you of being a heretic and so on. He says with them, he prefers not to engage. It's better not to get caught up into the, to use Girardian language, mimetic contagion of that kind of exchange. And as you know, famously, he was silent, faced with the dubia criticism of the four cardinals, and again with Archbishop Vigano's letter in August 2018, when he famously said on the plane, I'm not going to comment on this, to the journalists, he said, you go and investigate. So there are times when he simply falls silent. He doesn't ignore it, because he responds in other ways, but he doesn't respond directly. And he himself has talked a lot about this. But I think it's important to recognize, right, when we're having this discussion, is that there is such a thing, and there has always been such a thing, as a bad spirit resistance to the papacy. Hans Urs von Balthasar, the great Swiss theologian, who the Pope himself loves, and has a book on the office of Peter, which Bergoglio, when he was rector of the Collegio Maximo, used to teach. It was one of his central texts. Says of this, the gates of hell will not prevail against it, does not mean that the church and the office of Peter will not be attacked from all sides, but rather that it will be the magnetic force that attracts the darkest powers of world history. In other words, the church is a place of spiritual combat, and the papacy is necessarily a focus of that. In other words, these bad spirit attacks are something we should expect. Theologically, ecclesiologically, that is normal. So that's the first point to make, the distinction between criticism and resistance. Second distinction is obviously between the different groups and ideologies involved. And resistance takes many different forms. And I'm not going to try and be exhaustive, but you get the idea. There are the traditionalists, for example, or radical conservatives, who tend to value only those aspects of the historical church which stand in opposition to the modern world. They want a church, in other words, which is basically beleaguered and defensive and that is engaged in resisting modernity. And that's the lens through which they view almost everything. And therefore, Francis upsets them because he doesn't fulfill that mode. You've got the group, particularly in the US, of free market libertarians who resent Francis's critique of ecological destruction, his critique of the market, his critique, again, of a model of unrestrained consumption, which is resulting in the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. You've got the integralists, who would be particularly on the rise at the moment in national populism. So groups, in other words, who believe that Christianity should be enforced from the state by law. In other words, a kind of an idea of Christendom, an authoritarian model, which is particularly seductive at the moment because of people like Salvini in Italy, Orban in Hungary, and indeed Trump, who, they offer to effectively to defend Judeo-Christian civilization by scapegoating or opposing those they identify as the enemy or the newcomers and so on. So obviously they don't like Francis because of his radical choice to be with migrants, to urging countries to keep their doors open to migrants. And then you've got a kind of, in particularly again in the US, a culture warrior, Republican family values ideology, kinds of people, for whom the central concern is abortion and same-sex marriage, and they regard Francis as debilitating that because he asks the church to have a broader ethical offer. So we care about the unborn life in the womb, but we also care about the destruction of the rainforest. We care about the death penalty. We care about immigration. So by broadening out the ethical offer, the famous seamless garment, he's upset, of course, particular groups of people. And in this, and I know Americans never like being compared to other countries and other times, but I do see a big analogy between what Francis is trying to do with the church here in the US and what Leo XIII was seeking to do in France at the end of the 19th century. 19th century France was a place of a kind of culture war with the French Revolution, liberalism that came out of that, and the church on the side of reaction and monarchy. And there was this massive standoff throughout the 19th century. Leo XIII tries to break that stranglehold by in effect saying that Catholics can be Democrats. And the other thing he did was to produce the first ever social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, which, those of you know, called for just wages, said whatever the market decides is not necessarily right. There is a basic criteria of human dignity. And what's so fascinating is to look at the response. I have a whole chapter on Laudato Si in here, and its genesis, but also it's the response to it, particularly in the United States, very similar to the reaction that greeted Leo XIII. When Rerum Novarum came out, half of the bourgeois businessmen of Europe said, what the heck does the Pope know about free markets? What does he know about this? He's a Pope. He should be talking about faith and morals. So in other words, to declare that this area of human activity, the free market and so on, was a moral area, was an area where the gospel applies, very similar to what Francis has done with ecology, and he's met the same kind of resistance. So I think a lot can be explained here by Francis raising deep-seated fears, and we are talking about fears of the papacy being captured by progressives, which is a deep-seated fear of right-wing Catholics in America for a very long time. And Francis, I think, has, in a very straightforward way, said that we cannot simply have the gospel used in that way. He said, didn't he, if you remember, in September 2015, his speech to the bishops in Washington, D.C., the church falls into hopeless decline whenever we confuse the power of strength with the strength of that powerlessness with which God has redeemed us. In other words, it sets up a contradiction when you're evangelizing to proclaim a God who has embraced powerlessness, while at the same time you as a church seek power. It sets up a credibility problem there, which Francis he went on to say, he warned the bishops against making of the cross a banner of worldly struggles and of failing to realize that, quote, the price of lasting victory is allowing ourselves to be wounded and consumed, unquote. You see where I get the title of the book. So a third level of analysis, that's a third level analysis of the resistance, would be very much, as Massimo Fagioli has done, to look at it as resistance to the Second Vatican Council. And this is, of course, absolutely right. And he has written better than anybody else about the particular ecclesial culture and the reception of Vatican II and the difficulties so many Americans have had in embracing particularly Gaudium et Spes and Lumen Gentium. So Francis's determination to implement that theology and ecclesiology necessarily has produced a reaction. So at the heart of the rejection of this papacy is the same mindset and attitudes that we experienced at the Second Vatican Council in what's known as the minority group. And just to be clear about what this, without going into huge detail about it, because anyway, Massimo's written much better than I ever could about this, but at the heart of this shift of Vatican II is actually a way of thinking, an approach, to move to an essentially deductive pastoral approach. In other words, it's no longer enough just simply to believe things, right? There's actually a way of being, a way of doing things, which is about engaging with real human issues and reflecting on doctrine in the light of pastoral realities. That's what's known as the deductive pastoral approach. Now, of course, what you get with Francis is exactly that, but you get it supplemented also by a very Latin American ecclesial culture, which is sometimes called See, Judge, Act. Now, See, Judge, Act is a method developed first of all by Joseph Cardine in the 1920s, but really took off in Latin America as a method of applying this deductive pastoral approach. See, Judge, Act simply means you start by looking at concrete realities and you say, where is the problem? Where is the suffering? Where is the pain? And then you move then to a discernment and you move to action. Now, Francis has reformulated this triad of See, Judge, Act as contemplate, discern, and promote. Now, contemplate's important because how we look at reality is very significant. We don't look at there's a big argument within Latin American liberation theology about this, of course, but Bergoglio always took very clear view that we look with the eyes of the disciple, with the heart of the Good Shepherd. So we look with the eyes of the gospel at reality. And what are we looking for? What are we looking at? We're looking at pain. We're looking at suffering. We're looking with the heart of the Good Shepherd on the world. So we look at, a bit like in the beginning of the spiritual exercises, when God looks down on the earth and sees people locked in sin, in suffering, trapped, seduced, tempted, and so on. And the response of God in the spiritual exercises, as St. Ignatius imagines it, is not to produce a rule book, it's not to give a lecture, it's not to give a whole lot of moral principles, but the incarnation. God sends his Son. So that same approach, or that attitude, is key to this whole approach of the Latin American Church. Contemplate, discern, where is God speaking to us? Where is the Holy Spirit speaking to us in this situation? Where is God and where is the enemy, as it were, in all of this? What are we being called to? And then promote, act, in other words, how are we going to respond to that? It's very similar to what I said at the beginning happened at Aparecida. How do we need to change in order to evangelize this modernity? So that's the third level. But I think at a fourth level, to go even deeper now into this question of resistance, there is, if you like, an epistemological issue, which is why disagreements can be very intense around this. Epistemological in the sense of how we choose to perceive truth or perceive reality is really very, very significant. And I'm not a theologian, but my best way of understanding this is that at the council there is a shift from a kind of classicist or perceptual notion of knowledge. In other words, knowledge and truth is something out there, clean, pure, which if it's properly expressed, you either kind of accept or reject. So very similar to an ideological framework, a bit like, if you're a Marxist, you say that this is the truth, which you kind of either accepted or rejected. If you reject it, there's something wrong with you if it's properly presented to you, which is a kind of corruption of the way people used to think in the church, in the early church, which was much more of this kind of deductive pastoral approach. So Francis is very, very, very strong on this. I mean, he has a document called Gaudium Veritate on universities, which goes into this whole question of knowledge itself. And he says, philosophy and theology, which strengthen the intelligence and they illuminate the will, but they're only fruitful if the theologian, if it's done with an open mind and on your knees. In other words, it has to be done prayerfully, contemplatively, inviting the Holy Spirit into it, not as an idea, but as a reality. In other words, he says our thought has to be incomplete because it's always looking for the truth which is beyond concepts. And of course, famously in Gaudete et Exsultate, his great document on holiness, he warns us, doesn't he, about Gnostics, about people who've got an answer for everything. And we all know the type of person who's literally got an answer for everything. It's all worked out. You only have to go onto these websites to get your talking. That's truth for them. Truth is something you download, and it arrives all complete. Whereas for Francis, the good theologian always has an open and an incomplete thought, always open to where God wishes to lead you, which is always beyond where you are. And that's why he conceives of the church, famously, he is often referred to it, as St. Vincent of Lerins, the 6th century thinker, described it as the church is always developing. It's always on the move because history is unfurling. The doctrine remains the same, but it's unfurling over time. So, for example, recently, he amended the Catechism of the Catholic Church to say the death penalty is inadmissible under all circumstances. And there was a furious reaction, particularly from the United States. How dare he change Catholic doctrine? He's not changing Catholic doctrine. There is no doctrine on the death penalty. The doctrine is called the doctrine of the sanctity of life. That's the Catholic doctrine. And of course, what he's doing is applying the sanctity of life to the death penalty now in the light of changed circumstances. There was a time under Pius XII when the church defended the death penalty. In the 19th century, the Vatican executed people. You can go and see the guillotine in the Vatican museums. It was a present, I think, from the French. The Vatican, and the Papal States. Things have moved on, but it's the same understanding, the same doctrine of life which is being unfurled. But if you have an idea that doctrine is something fixed and static, that it can't ever be changed, then of course these are very upsetting. Francis insists that by itself knowledge of law and doctrine is just not enough. There's a homily he gave, which I love, in Medellin airport in Colombia in September 2017, when he said Jesus' disciples needed to be purified of their attachment to precepts, prohibitions, and mandates, and the rigorous fulfillment of rituals and practices. In other words, they were good religious Jews, right, who performed the law and believed in the law, and that's why they needed to be purified. Because the faithful obedience of all these things prevented them from asking the discernment question. What does God want? What is the Holy Spirit's will here? And for that reason, Francis says, Jesus led them out to the lepers, to the paralytics, to the sinners, to the people out on the margins, the people they didn't know, the people who had very complicated lives and very complex needs. And he said their salvation requires much more than the simple recipes that you've got in your mind. In challenging his disciples, Jesus was seeking to change their hermeneutic, their mindset, to replace the narrow, myopic spectacles of the doctors of the law and give them the wide-angled lens of the Good Shepherd, which is fundamentally a heart of openness and gratitude, a tender, maternal kind of heart. In other words, it's about applying the law not as an instrument of control, but as a means of, of healing and grace. And this is the core difference, is it not, between the stance of Jesus, the way of discernment, and the stance of the Pharisees, which is essentially legalistic or rigoristic. And you can see that with Francis there is a clear shift, a clear determined shift in the direction of Jesus and away from the Pharisees, in seeking to bring about this a shift above all in Amoris Laetitia, which does it, I think, in a remarkable way. Francis, of course, then has faced tremendous accusations, the same accusations that Jesus faced, of undermining law and doctrine because of the attentiveness to the particular, because of the attentiveness to pastoral realities without compromising doctrine. But that, for those who have this idea of fixity, looks like a dilution. So he has always talked in his own Jesuit writings. I have a collection of 3 books of his writings as a Jesuit. They're extraordinary, and I keep saying, and I've said it on this book tour a lot, I don't know why they haven't appeared in English. Anyway, I've said this so many times now that I'm now in conversation with a couple of publishers, so hopefully they will be. But he talks a lot there about the polarity between the particular and the universal. In other words, that we're called as disciples to navigate this tension, this polarity. And that in that tension we find, if we use discernment and we are open to the Holy Spirit, new paths and new ways of thinking are created. That the problem is that too often we seek to annihilate that tension because we don't like living in tension. Yeah? So we eliminate one of the poles in favour of the other. But for him, the mind of Christ is precisely that capacity to hold those things in tension. This is the heart of his own work, by the way. He did a doctorate on this very topic of what's called polarities. So one way of seeing the ecclesial reforms of Francis, which I think are absolutely central to this pontificate, above all the synods, is all about embedding this theological method of the council, enabling the church to be a Samaritan church, or in his phrase, a field hospital church, bringing the mercy of God to situations of human pain and suffering, whether the fruit of ignorance and sin, or whether as a result of circumstance, of injustice, and so on. But he's, above all, what he's doing in the synods is using the See, Judge, Act, the contemplate, discern, propose method, and bringing the pastoral reality into tension with the doctrine. In tension in the sense that putting them together. We've just had it now in the Amazonia Synod in October. I was there for the whole synod. And the whole thing starts with, and has right there at the heart of it, the reality of Amazonia. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon suffering, tremendous violence against them, loss of their lands, exploitation, big multinationals, carving up Amazonia, deforestation. We had that at the very beginning of the synod. That's what we started with. And then the next question became, well, how can the church respond to this? How can the church be better present there? And that's where all these other questions about ministries and diaconate and should we ordain. But do you see, you start with the reality and you look upon it with the eyes with the eyes of the gospel. And that's really the inductive pastoral discerning method. And here are 5 ways in which I think the synods really embed this method. First of all, as I've said, it embeds this 3-step process: contemplate, discern, propose. The family synod, which set out to ask, the church asked the very difficult question: why is it so difficult to live out the doctrine of the family? Why is it so hard to have marital indissolubility? Why are so many Catholics not marrying, and why are so many divorcing? What's the reality out there that we need to confront? The youth synod, the alienation of youth, the problems that so many young people experience in a kind of technocratic society where there's very little work and so on. Or indeed now with the Amazon. So starting not with a theological idea or a doctrine, not to say this is the truth and how do we apply it so that everybody agrees with us, but rather what is the human pain and the situation that we need to respond to. So secondly, looking with the hermeneutic of the Good Shepherd. Where are the wounds? Where are the vulnerabilities? In the case of the family synod, it was the divorced and remarried, the people who were alienated from the church by their circumstances. And of course, it immediately provoked a response of fear from people to say, well, shouldn't we just be telling the truth? So if you ask yourself what the Amazonian people believe and feel, aren't we risking maybe learning something from them? Surely our job is just to tell them what to think. We had that with the working document of the Synod, immediately criticised by Cardinal Muller and others as heretical. Because it should be, again, I remember Cardinal Burke saying about the family synod with the working document, he said he didn't really understand it because he thought of the church was supposed to give everybody a lecture. Instead, they were doing something rather different. Above all, so the synods always start with this coming close. Now, this for Francis is absolutely key. He often talks about the synktakabasis, the coming down in order to come close. The action of God who saves us is always a coming down in order to come close. It's an incarnation. An incarnation isn't an idea, it's a person becoming, taking on humanity, taking on culture, a language, a place, a people, a family. I have a whole chapter in here called Close and Concrete, which is seeking to capture this. So in a way, one way of seeing the Francis pontificate is he's doing everything to get rid of everything that separates the church from that process of coming close, or everything that stops it doing so. So in this synod on Amazonia, there was a big emphasis on evangelization through inculturation. Inculturation is absolutely key to evangelization. he said right at the beginning, the Pope at the synod, at the end of the synod, he said, the real weight of the synod could be felt in its diagnostic. And what he meant by that was the way the church looked. In other words, that the synod has succeeded, and it was a great synod, in looking at the Amazon and its people through those eyes of the pastor. So the synod had actually emulated this Cinctac Abbasis. So he was delighted because the synod had succeeded in bringing church close to the human realities, to the wounds of humanity, and to have developed concrete responses. So the object of all of this of the synods is to be better present. In his first speech, Francis said that the pastoral dimension was the essential one, the one that encompasses all the others. And he went on to say that when we look with the eyes of disciples and missionary, when we respect their culture, when we respect their self-awareness, their suffering, their longing, their need of safety and so on, when we recognize them and respect them as protagonists of their own history, then the gospel can be planted, the gospel can be brought alive. On the other hand, he warned us against colonial mentalities, what he called ideological colonization, homogenizing centralism, a kind of racist, if you like, colonialist kind of attitude, which, by the way, is exactly what some of the church managed to demonstrate in the synod. It was a fascinating example. The thing he was warning against, the very object of the synod, was to come close, and so many reacted by accusing the indigenous people of worshipping pagan idols. So when they tried to speak, they were told they were heretics. When they tried to pray in Rome, they were told they were worshipping idols. Francis pointed to history in that speech and said, when the church forgets how to be enculturated, how to come close to a people, then it doesn't enculturate and it doesn't evangelize. So for him, evangelization and enculturation are the two things. And so the synod is a method of enculturation. Fourthly, it's a means of what the Jesuits call discernment in common. Discernment in common means you take a group of people and you prepare for it very carefully, you do lots of research, you discuss, but ultimately what you're doing is inviting the Holy Spirit to show you the way. And there's a whole lot of Jesuit thinking about how this is to be done. But it's right there at the heart of the church. It's in every conclave. This is really at the heart of what it means to be church, how the church makes decisions. And of course, the result of discernment is that if there is the signs of the Holy Spirit being present in the synod, which would mean a consensus, not unanimity, there's never unanimity, but if there's a consensus which brings peace, and people feel it, and I felt it in all these synods that I've been in, people kind of go, oh wow, there's another way of looking at this. There's a way that transcends the things we've been discussing. It brings this sense of great peace. It is a genuinely spiritual experience. And then fifthly, the effect of this is very uniting. The synods help to unite the church. Bishop McElroy of San Diego, a wonderful man, was at the synod on Amazonia and came back from it. I don't know whether you've seen, but he gave a lecture, which is an article at National Catholic Reporter, saying this is exactly what the US church needs in a context of polarization where the church is unable to evangelize. We need a synodal process to allow the Holy Spirit in. When we're polarized and paralyzed, then we have to have a process of listening, of dialogue, but which is also allows the Holy Spirit to open up new paths. In his speech of October 2015, on the 15th anniversary of the refounding of the Synod, Francis said that the path of synodality was what God was asking of the church in the third millennium. Journeying together, laity, pastors, the Bishop of Rome, is an easy concept to put into words, but not so easy to put into practice. And one of the things he said at the beginning of this Synod in October was, we're getting better at this. The church is learning really for the first time how to do this properly. But he went on to say that it was important not to separate the learning church, the church that learns, docens, from the teaching church. The listening church from the teaching church. In other words, if the church wants to teach, it has to listen. And this is all about allowing a dialogue between the people and the bishops and the Pope. When that happens and it's genuine, then it is of the Holy Spirit. I say all this because it seems to me very obvious, having reported on the synods, and in the book I have a whole chapter on the family synod. It's called This Turbulent Synod, This Turbulent Family, this turbulent family, where I show how through those two synods of 2014 and 2015, real change took place. There was a pastoral conversion. Those bishops went into it saying, I don't know how we do this. Okay, well, I get that we need to integrate the divorced and the remarried, but on the other hand, we have marital indissolubility, we have the sacramental law. How the heck do we reconcile those two things? In other words, they went in seeing it as a contradiction. And through this process, they came to see it in a different light. And that's what resulted in Amoris Laetitia. So that is an experience of the Holy Spirit, because it's the Holy Spirit traditionally in the church which has helped the church to navigate this polarity of the universal and the particular, the global and the local, and so on. It's ultimately the incarnation is a complexio oppositorium, a way of reconciling what appear to be opposites. And fascinating, isn't it, that the various critics at the moment of Francis who are writing about the synod as if it isn't, as if it's got nothing to do with the Holy Spirit. I was just reading today an article by George Weigel, who was trying to make out that the synod was a kind of rule by committee which is seeking to impose a German-type agenda on the rest of the world, just simply fails to see what it is. And Archbishop Chaput again saying, I'm not sure what this term synodality means. I think it's something from the Eastern Church. It's really not. It's something at the heart of the Western Catholic tradition. So I want to just move in the last part of this to another level of analysis of talking about the resistance, which comes from Bergoglio's own writings. And he's got a key term there, which I think is very beautiful and very interesting. And I don't think any of you will have heard it before. And the term is isolated conscience. Now, I was going to say that this term hasn't been used by him as a pope. He used it a lot as a Jesuit and occasionally as cardinal. But I'd never heard him say it as pope until I put it into my Evernote in Spanish, Conciencia Aislada, and I realized that it's in paragraph 2 of Evangelii Gaudium. So Evangelii Gaudium begins in that first paragraph with talking about how the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Christ, and then he calls on the church to go out and proclaim that news joyfully. And then in paragraph 2, he points to the obstacles of that, what prevents us doing that. And in Spanish, he uses this term, isolated conscience, but it's been badly translated into English, as so often, as blunted conscience, which it really isn't. It's a very different idea. I think in Italian it's okay, conciencia isolata, but in Spanish, in English it's come out as blunted conscience. So none of you realize that he's used that phrase. What does he mean by it? In his writings as a Jesuit, he talked a lot about the isolated conscience, which is isolated from the march of the people of God. So in Bergoglio's vision, very much Lumen Gentium, but again very Latin American, God is forming his people, into a unity. And that those people who wish to avoid that process, to withdraw themselves from that process, are trying to cling to something which is preventing them joining them. They have the isolated conscience. So it's associated in his writings with clericalism, with rigidity, with moralism, the obsession with appearances, a mentality of domination rather than service, with the lack of mercy in the confessional, and obviously all kinds of corruption. Finally, of course, the corruption of clerical sex abuse. It's a deformation, it is a corruption, which in his speech to the cardinals prior to the conclave, he compares to the woman who's bent over in the Gospel of Luke, who can't look up. You know, she can only look at herself. She's paralyzed. She's self-referential, and she doesn't see beyond herself. Now, interestingly, when he gave a very similar speech in Aparecida, 2007, almost identical to the speech he gave to the cardinals, but he added a phrase in the 2007 one. It says, "The church turned in on herself, y el pueblo de Dios allá afuera," the people of God somewhere off, right? Now, this is a really, really significant idea. So really what he's saying is that all these problems with the church, clericalism and so on, come from the fact that the institution has withdrawn from the people. So the people of God know God, God is there among the people of God, God is with the people of God, and the institution has withdrawn. And you can see in his discernment or during the clerical sex abuse crisis in 2018, when he's really calling on the people of God to to purify the church, to restore Christ to the center of the church, saying, look, this isn't going to be a problem we solve by sacking a few bishops. It's not just a clean-up of the institution here. The church needs to refound itself in the people of God, because that's where God is present. And again, in Evangelii Gaudium, the church evangelizes itself. The church goes out to the people of God all the time, encounters God, and is evangelized, right? So there's that constant process of evangelizing and being evangelized. So when he talks about the isolated conscience, it's the conscience that refuses to do this. And he's asked in his Jesuit writings, when I have the isolated conscience, what is it that I'm seeking to hold on to? And he has a whole essay on all the things that you might be wanting to try hold on to. Your freedom, your idea that you are in charge, your own ideas about doing things, but also rather more challengingly, he talks about wealth, honours, pride, all that stuff which, as it were, is how the devil gets in. And he has a whole lot of writings on how to counter that tendency to the isolated conscience, which are very, very interesting. Now, in an address, just to understand a little bit better this idea of the isolated conscience, this is, I think, the best account he's ever given. In 2002, he gave a homily in Buenos Aires Cathedral, so he's Cardinal Archbishop at this point. And he ponders the story, which you're all very familiar with, of Zacchaeus, the short of stature tax collector who, after encountering Jesus, remember, Jesus invites him down from the tree, and he promises to sell everything that he's taken from the people and so on. Now, Bergoglio, in reflecting on this, talks about how Zacchaeus has become part of the people, and he uses the expression in Spanish, so he who was anti-pueblo is now pueblo, okay? So, of course, Zacchaeus remains a tax collector. It's not a socio-economic business. He remains a tax collector, but he's a transformed tax collector with now an attitude of service who sees himself alongside the mass of ordinary people. He's become part of the people because he's renounced his arrogance and his separateness, his self-sufficiency. He serves rather than exploits. He's turned, as he said to the young people in Chile, from materialism to solidarity. So we can begin to understand, can we not, Francis's sustained assault on clericalism from the very beginning of his papacy, because clericalism is basically anti-pueblo. It's the refusal to belong to the people of God. It's a form of evangelization, an attitude, as Bergoglio says, which is all about evangelizing for the people, but without the people. For the people, but without the people. All for the people, but never with the people. As he puts it to the Jesuits in Colombia. So clericalism is a failure to evangelize. It's an oligarchic form of corruption. It's something that seeks to use the goods of the church to profit from the people of God rather than serve the people of God. Before his election, so this is actually back in 2007, just after Aparecida, he gave this interview in which he talked about the prophet Jonah. Jonah, sent by God to evangelize Nineveh, wicked city. God, of course, wants to save Nineveh, asks Jonah to go, and Jonah doesn't like this at all because Jonah's a good, upstanding religious person, and as far as he's concerned, he's saved, and the people of Nineveh are not saved, and damn it if he's going to go and, do you know what I mean? What he's really running away from, says Bergoglio in this, is the mercy of God. That's what he hates. Because once you accept the universal mercy of God, you can no longer arrogate to yourself the power of religion. So he talks about an example of the isolated conscience is Jonah. And in another one of his writings, Bergoglio noted how, for St. Ignatius of Loyola, consolation was not to be found in the absence of conflict, nor in the absence of persecution and tribulation. In other words, there's no attempt here at finding peace at any price. Rather, tension is normal, disagreement is normal. And disagreement in and of itself doesn't produce a lack of unity. What produces a lack of unity, he says, and what always brings with it a fissure in the body of the society, of Jesus that is brought on by self-sufficiency. So it's the idea that we don't need salvation. We have everything we need. We have doctrine, we have truth, we have the Eucharist, we have the tradition. We're fine, we're great. No, we're saved. That's the attitude that he sees as the one that St. Ignatius was most frightened of, because it's an attitude of self-sufficiency rather than the humble attitude of insufficiency, which is always asking for God's grace. So the kind of thinking that goes along with the isolated conscience is precisely what Bergoglio critiques as a kind of Gnosticism. And he, in his whole life, as I've documented, he's had to confront in his life many forms of what one might call rigid or deductive thinking, whether the Marxism of the 1950s, the neo-scholasticism of his early Jesuit formation, Vatican centralism and authoritarianism, the rigidity of legalism and traditionalism. Why do all these matter so much? Because ultimately they represent a kind of a gnosis, a withdrawal into abstract reasoning, which ultimately is a refusal of the fleshly reality of humanity. So there's a gnosis, there's an anti-incarnational move there. And failing to realize that the eternal truths revealed by Jesus Christ are always historically conditioned, and they're always open to further deepening under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And that's why in Evangelii Gaudium Francis challenges those who long for a monolithic body of doctrine guarded by all and leaving no room for nuance. Beautiful phrase. And he warns, doesn't he, in Evangelii Gaudium, that where the God of love is obscured, it is because doctrinal or moral points based on specific ideological options are being preached instead of the gospel. He once said as cardinal that truth is like a precious stone. When you offer it in your hand, it captivates people. It seduces them. But if you throw it at somebody, it wounds them, it bruises them. It's the same stone. But in the case of the truth of the Catholic Church, when we offer the truth without the mercy of Jesus Christ, without the encounter with the person of Christ, then we reduce faith to a kind of ideology. So this is what I want to suggest to you is the real battleground of this pontificate. The real heart of the resistance to this Pope is rooted in what I call in the book rather daringly, nobody's going to like it very much, or some people aren't going to like it, invidia. It's what the Pharisees suffered from. Remember, the Pharisees look at Jesus, they know he's a person of power, they see his healings, but they feel deeply threatened by him. They can't accept him. They see him as an enemy, and they set out ultimately to kill him. They suffer from invidia, from where we get the word envy. Invidia means a kind of a not seeing, or a seeing through this sort of thick lens. And I look at so many critiques of this Pope and this papacy, and I see invidia, I see a not seeing, I see a failure to grasp who he is, which is ultimately rooted not in some kind of intellectual misapprehension of the Pope, but rather something much deeper, much more spiritual, something that's in the heart. And I saw it particularly at this synod now in the Amazon. That's what really occurred to me very strongly, that these attacks, this resistance, are really a power play in the sense that von Balthasar meant it. The church is always going to attract the dark forces of history, that there is a power play going on. When Cardinal Mulder and Cardinal Burke issue these long, dull declarations aiming to clear up what they call confusion in the church, it's a power play. It's an attempt to arrogate for themselves the magisterium, and it's an attempt to contest the magisterium, to provide, as I think Massimo once said, an alternative magisterium to the one being offered by Francis. So in their invidia, their envy, their fury, their Manichaean view of the world, their rigidity, really they're seeking to do what the Pharisees did, what the Sanhedrin did, which is to arrogate to themselves the tradition of the church and the universal love of God. So in doing so, I suggest they reveal their isolated conscience. They attack the Pope, but the real target of their fury is the protagonism of the faithful, the unity of the people of God, and I think even the incarnation itself. Thank you very much.
I think the words about the isolated conscience are very instructive in more than one way. As a phrase, I think it could be misunderstood as applying only to individuals. When we see in our country how groups of people have become almost tribal in the way they support one another and therefore dull one another's consciences. Yeah. Would that be something
No, absolutely.
Francis would also include?
And in fact, he talks about groups of who suffer this isolated conscience, and they feed off each other, and they become gradually more and more alienated from, and they end up with he has a whole essay on how they develop this kind of victim mentality, that everybody's now persecuting them. So they have this sense of grievance. Everybody out there is bad, they're good, and they're being mistreated. They become, as Bergoglio says, collectors of injustices. Constantly listing all the grievances. And that's true, isn't it, of many of the critics of the Pope. We're not understood by him. He treats priests really badly when he talks about rigidity. You know, he doesn't understand America. You know, if any he'd spent time here and he'd realised the glories of the free market, he would. You know, it's that kind of, he's always to blame, never them. So it's a spirit of accusation. He has a whole wonderful essay. One of my favourite essays of his is called "On Self-Accusation," and it shows how the bad spirit, the devil, if you like, the tempter, the diabolos, always accuses, whereas the holy response is to accuse yourself, because by accusing yourself, you invite the mercy of God. Whereas if you accuse others, you remain self-sufficient. And it struck me, you know, reading this, that you look at all the people who have attacked him, not least Vigano, there's a complete absence of any self-criticism there. You know, they always justify themselves and accuse others. So he gives us, with these essays and with some of his homilies, he gives the people of God instruments for their own discernment. What's really going on here, you know? He doesn't tell us what to think. He gives us the tools to discern, which I think is a mark of his greatness as a spiritual leader. So have I bludgeoned you all into submission? It was a bit of a heavy talk, I know. Massimo.
So your Francis asked you to be more critical with him. So my question for you is there anything that he doesn't see, blind spots, or things that he shows his limits?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, it's no great revelation, because I documented in detail there, as you know, he famously got wrong his defense of a bishop in Chile, Juan Barros. And when he realized just how wrong he had got it, he issued this very, very contrite apology. But not just apologized, but as I document in the book, it changed his whole discernment of the whole issue of abuse, and actually moved him to a whole new level in response to the sex abuse crisis. So why did he get it so wrong? Well, because, I mean, if the Pope, I mean, everybody says this about Bergoglio, who's ever worked with him, he's incredibly obstinate. Yeah, he's like a bulldozer. So he actually takes quite a long time to make a decision, and he discerns very carefully, and he inquires. He's very good at, you know, getting information. He knows. People are always amazed by Francis that he simply seems to know everything, right? Because he never relies on secondary pieces of information. But in this case, he really got it wrong, and he got it wrong because his sources of information, and I document in the book, were all keeping stuff from him. They were all interested in him not seeing the Karadima case for what it was. And that's when he realized that he was dealing with a case of corruption. Because he has a famous distinction between sin and corruption. Sin, if you're sinning, you kind of want to escape sin, right? Whereas if you're corrupt, you deny it. So the only way of dealing with corruption is to confront them with the truth. It's like in the movies, you know, the guy who, you know, it's only when he goes to jail and his wife leaves him that he faces, you know, his corruption. It's the same with the church. So that's what moved him to a different response to the whole crisis when he saw it as a question of corruption. But he only realized that because he saw himself that he had been completely misinformed by literally everybody. So I think there are other examples, I think also of appointments that he's made where, you know, one might say, well, he could have been better informed. So I'd say that's where his weakness lies. I think he's very aware of it, but that's where his weakness lies.
The chapter on mediators, not middlemen,
Yeah.
really deals with the whole economic situation of the Vatican. You know, it's like a puzzle that you pull all the pieces together. It's really fascinating. But realizing that the Vatican was dealing with the possibility of bankruptcy. And no one, I mean, it was an antiquated system. They didn't have adequate ways of accountability. And the point you make is Francis made clear to Zafar that there were two important extra principles involved in the makeover: the Vatican's universality and the presence of qualified people. The two principles were related. The leading posts in finances were almost all occupied by Italian clergy. And to throw off the Italian patronage networks, the Vatican needed a global professional workforce. That must have been really, really difficult. Because when you look at it.
Well,
I
it
mean,
still is.
Huh?
I mean, it is. I mean,
It still is.
and if you're looking at why, you know, where the reforms in the Vatican have taken a long time, you know, people say you need to de-Italianize the Curia. Well, actually, it relies on a mostly very hard, you know, hard-working, intelligent, capable bureaucracy. Some of them aren't, but a lot of them are. And they're accustomed to working in a particular way for quite low salaries. A lot of them, of course, at the senior levels are monsignors or religious. All you have to do is give them an apartment, you know, and a bit of a salary, and they're fine, right? Whereas if you're to bring over a professional lay person who's got a family, I mean, I'll just give you an anecdote. Cardinal Farrell, who's the head of the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life, I know that he wanted to appoint as his number 2 an American woman who he just, I don't know who she is, but he deeply admired her and thought she would be amazing for the job. But he told me, you know, they reckoned it would cost $500,000, you know, for her to relocate from wherever she was with her family. And the Vatican just doesn't have that kind of budget, particularly for the reasons that you said. So I think, you know, a lot of the Vatican reform is about dealing with reality. And I think actually his patience and working within the constraints and the limitations of the Vatican, and yet seeking a quite profound cultural change is really quite, in a way, quite brilliant, you know. But people on the outside say, well, where's the change? But actually the change in attitude is real, as I document in the financial chapter.
That's fascinating. You quote John the 23rd saying, when he was asked the question, how many people work in the Vatican, and he said about half. Yeah. Anyway, I thought it was funny.
Yeah. It is a good joke. Yeah.
The resistance you described, has it increased or decreased since he's become pope?
Oh.
What is the trajectory?
Yeah, no, unquestionably increased. And I think, you know, this is why, as a commentator, you know, I'm not writing a book of theology here. I'm not a theologian. This is narrative non-fiction. I'm telling the story. But, you know, when you stand back, that's why this book's actually been very complicated to write. What is the story of the pontificate? You know, you can't try and tell everything. If I was to do something very systematic, it would be a very dull book, you know. So I found myself thinking a bit like Jesuits when they do an examine on their, you know, look back on their day or their week. They look for where the, you know, where's the tension, where's the action, you know. And of course you see that, and that's what I was saying in my talk, you know, there are moments in this pontificate where the resistance just flares up and is really vehement and venomous. You know, a level of disrespect shown to the papacy, which is almost unprecedented in modern times. I don't know whether you'd agree with that. You know, I mean, the shocking language that's used about the Pope from, you know, cardinals. Now, there are not many of them. You know, it's the same names that recur constantly. But it's very organised. You know, I'm often asked about this. How organised is this opposition? Well, they have a strategy that every month they do something that tries to weaken the Pope's image. And they're using the same, you know, American impeachment techniques. It's well organised. Steve Bannon advises them. You know, I mean, I can go into... But, you know, ultimately it's not a very big group, but very, very wealthy people, very wealthy organisations, and quite sophisticated forms of attack, so that almost every month there'll be a letter, you know, denouncing something, and the idea is to debilitate him in advance of the next conclave, so that at the next conclave the cardinals will want an alternative. You know, in that sense, it's organised, and it's definitely growing. Yeah.
And what did they want to return to?
Well, that's a great question. That is a very good question. You know, what is the plan? You know, I mean, I suppose they have an idea about the 1950s as a kind of golden age. I mean, where Christianity is imposed by the state, or at least defended in law, which is, by the way, important. I mean, Christians need to work for Christian laws and so on. But we are living in an age of secularization where Christianity has been expelled largely from law and culture. So to remain focused on that is a particular mindset which, you know, in a way isn't helpful. But yeah, what do they want? They want a much more moralistic kind of a church. They want, I mean, as they see it, one that doesn't concede to modernity, so a much more beleaguered defensive church. I think some of them have a kind of what we might call a neo-Donatist idea that everything out there is going to hell, and we need to pull up the drawbridge and create a kind of an island of It's a very, I think in many ways, a very American Calvinist notion of the separation of church and the world. It's the Benedictine option, one might say. So, yeah, it's actually, your question has slightly floored me, because actually when you think about what is it they actually want, it's much harder, isn't it? They know what they don't want. They're very critical. But what do they want? I was in Notre Dame the other day, university, and they have, I don't know whether you know, they have some exhibitions of Christopher Columbus. Do you know that exhibition? Anyway, they've got a picture of the Spanish king and queen, and over here, these native Indians that have been brought, you know, and the king and queen are kind of, you know, looking these natives over and so on. And I put on Twitter, this is the synod on the Amazonia that Cardinal Muller would have liked. But
Yes, Brian.
How much is the resistance within the Catholic Church finding strange bedfellows with the ultra-conservative, like Protestant, like the evangelical wings?
yeah. That's a great question. I think traditionally, at least in the USA, there was an alliance, wasn't there, between Catholic conservatives and evangelicals, a very explicit alliance. It was called the Alliance for Freedom, wasn't it? And, you know, First Things, which were represented and so on. So I think that is in many ways the people who are resisting the papacy, and I think that alliance continues. I think the new factor now is the national populists. I know many young, particularly Catholic traditionalists who, you know, they really get very excited by Salvini in Italy and Orban in Hungary and Brexit and Trump, you know, because they think this is some kind of movement of restoration, you know. It's very seductive. And one thing I've also said about particularly younger Catholics who are very seduced by this, you know, we have to understand that this is a very difficult world now, you know, to grow up in and to be a Christian and to have any values. You know, individualism and relativism and the so-called liquid society is very real, and people want a refuge from that. So I think what's happening is that a lot of people are looking to the church because it's such a millenarian institution, and they want the church to be something that's outside time, that's a kind of religiously sanctioned rock of objectivity that's resistant to change. So in other words, it's a psychological projection, which is at the root of fundamentalism, really. But, and it's easy to critique, and obviously I do, but at the same time we have to understand the anguish that lies at the heart of that. And that Francis is very good on this, that the church has to know how to respond to the anguish of contemporary person, which is an anguish which is saying, will I find sanctuary? Will I be loved? Is there a place of unconditional love? Or am I to be judged by the technocratic paradigm that now dominates our society? And the church, that's why the church has to become a place of, it has to be a Samaritan church, has to be a place of mercy, a place of unconditional love and acceptance, because out there it's getting very cold and very brutal, you know.
One last question.
And just a comment, I wonder to what degree the phrase "follow the money" isn't very appropriate here, both within the Catholic and the evangelical movement.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how to articulate
No,
the
well,
economic piece, but it's got to be there.
Yeah.
And I think it's got to be there in ways that are foundational.
Yeah. I mean, I think in many ways the challenge in America is money, and one of the challenges is, you know, on this tour, I've been to some wonderful institutions, you know. As a European, I'm deeply impressed by the American church. They have just an amazing institutions, strong, wonderful institutions. But I've also come to see that that's the problem, because your whole mindset becomes, how do I maintain this? How do I keep this going? And, you know, the donor culture is a real, I think, a very real problem here. I've trod on some delicate territory in the book. So I've described in the chapter on Pope's visit to Latin America, and I've included the US visit in that. Francis went to the St. Patrick's Cathedral, do you remember, in September 2015? And what was supposed to be Vespers or evening prayer with the clergy and the religious of the diocese, okay? So the whole cathedral was supposed to be filled with the clergy and the nuns and the sisters of the diocese. Francis got there and he found that the first half of the cathedral were all men dressed in suits and women in pearls. They were the donors. He had basically handed out half of the seats to the donors. And I know many religious who couldn't go there that night. Francis arrived and he was furious, and I've got what he said when he arrived. He was livid. He said, where are the religious? Yeah. The people that read out the intercessions during that Vespers were the very, very big donors, the kind of half a million. Okay, here's another story. An archbishop, I won't name him, said to me very early on, after my first book came out, he said to me, an American archbishop, how do I get to Francis? And I said, what do you mean? You're asking me? You're an archbishop. You're asking me how you get to the Pope. I said, well, you know. He said, yeah. He said, well, with John Paul II and Benedict, I knew how it worked. I had a donor. I could arrange a baciamano, which is the word you use for going to greet the Pope, you know. Have Mass with the Pope, photograph, donor has a photo on his desk, donor's happy. I can't do that anymore, he says. And I say in the book, Francis has taken that away. If you want to have Mass with the Pope, he says Mass every morning, virtually at 7 a.m. I was just there 3 weeks ago having Mass with him. I mean, if you've got a good reason to be there, anybody can go there, right? You can't buy access to the Pope. He's kicked all that away. But it's left a number of American archbishops with their whole kind of fundraising donor schemes completely, you know, they're flawed back. So, yeah. I think one has to understand the shift of this papacy for the American church. I think it's on a number of levels, and I do think money is a big part of it. It's been lovely to be with you. Thank you very much indeed for this chance. Thank you. Thank you.